We're going to continue with our discussion on the Reconstruction process that took place in our country. So this is part 2 of Reconstruction. Let's do a real brief review of some of the aspects of Reconstruction that were mentioned in the first recording. First of all, the difference between the two main views of the Congress and the presidents during the Reconstruction period, the moderate view versus the radical view. The moderate were more concerned with getting the country back together in an easier fashion, and that would include not being quite so harsh on the South in the terms that were set out for what they would have to do to be readmitted. Moderates were more concerned with whites and the progress of the white middle class as opposed to making sure that newly freed slaves were given rights. The radical view was just that. They wanted to make sure that these newly freed African Americans would have certain guarantees of their newfound freedoms that would be recognized by all states, not just the northern states. We discussed Lincoln and his plan for Reconstruction even before the Civil War was over. He would definitely be considered a moderate because he did not want harsh, extreme changes on the South or for there to be huge new ways of life for African Americans. He was in favor of freeing the slaves, but he didn't go into a lot of detail about how slaves should be treated once they were freed. We talked about how there were people in Congress who objected to Lincoln's being pretty easy on the South. These Congress members wanted more strict punishments on the South and for there to be more people required to take the oath of loyalty. We talked about President Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated, and the fact that he would definitely be considered a moderate as well. He was more for the interest of poor whites and middle-class whites, and for the rich planters of the South to be completely wiped clean of their power. He hated the fact that these rich white Southerners had dominated society before, because he was from a poor background himself. So he would definitely be considered moderate. He definitely was not concerned with rights and freedoms given to freed slaves. And his plan was to require an oath of allegiance similar to Lincoln and to the Wade-Davis bill, but he really targeted in on these rich whites. He would not allow them to have any type of a say in the new Southern state governments, to take an oath of loyalty, or to be a part of the new constitutional conventions. And so therefore you can see what his main goals were. So now let's pick up with our discussion of how President Johnson and Congress had a serious clash with each other. The Congress was dominated by Republicans because that was the political party that was in control of the Union during the years of the Civil War. That was the political party that Lincoln was from. The Democrats were mostly in the South at the time, and we know since the South was defeated, the Democrats didn't have much of a voice in the Congress anymore. So it was dominated by Republicans, and they basically wanted the things that you see at the top here. They wanted to make sure that the Southern states' new governments after the Civil War were not dominated by the same people that were in power before the Civil War. They did not want the old Southern ruling class to gain more power and influence like they had before. They wanted to make sure that the society that developed in the South would reflect the ideals of the country moving forward into the future. People should have same basic rights and opportunities, regardless of their abilities or their backgrounds or their ethnicity. And many Republicans in Congress, this is kind of a selfish thing, but many Republicans in Congress realized that if they made sure that newly freed slaves could get the right to vote, that they would be grateful and then most likely vote Republican in the future. And that would also prevent the Democrats in the southern states that had been in power before the Civil War from returning to power. So that's kind of a selfish thing, but it definitely was a politically motivated thing. President Johnson, because he was more moderate in nature and was more concerned about the white middle class and lower class, was pretty much against what the Republicans in Congress were wanting. And the Republicans in Congress had passed a couple of things that Johnson flat out vetoed. A veto is when the president refuses to accept a law made by Congress, so therefore it doesn't become a law. The Republicans in Congress had created that Freedmen's Bureau that we discussed back here, and the Freedmen's Bureau was basically an agency to help newly freed slaves get on their feet by establishing schools, soup kitchens, and other types of shelter to help them. President Johnson vetoed a bill that was meant to increase the services that the Freedmen's Bureau was prepared to offer. So by vetoing this bill, it basically showed that he disagreed with the whole idea of a Freedmen's Bureau and therefore disagreed with making sure that protections and opportunities were given to blacks. Another thing that the Republican Congress had created was something called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And that law, when it was created, was meant to strike down the black codes. If you remember, we talked about black codes in the last recording. These were restrictions that the southern states were putting on to newly freed African Americans. The southern states had accepted the fact that there was no more slaves, but then they felt like to kind of get around that, they could put all kinds of regulations on the lives of African Americans to make them be pretty much like slaves. So this Civil Rights Act of 1866 was meant to stop some of those black codes. But here you can see that Johnson vetoed that law, which meant that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 could not come into action. And therefore, southern states could get away with putting these black codes into effect. When Congress saw that Johnson vetoed both of these bills, the one to increase the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, to them that proved that Johnson was a white supremacist and pretty much was like many of the Southerners in the South to begin with. It shocked them, and one thing that the Congress can do under our Constitution is override a presidential veto. It's difficult to do because they have to get 2/3 of Congress members to agree to override a veto. It's more than just getting the simple 50% majority to pass a law. But in this case, because they were so shocked at Johnson vetoing two of their ideas, that moderate Republicans, which were the ones more concerned with whites and not huge changes in the South, actually united with a lot of the radical Republicans in Congress that were more for the extreme changes. And because they united together, they were able to get this 2/3 vote and override the vetoes that Johnson had put on the Civil Rights Act. In addition to this, the Congress created the 14th Amendment, which said that the government was now responsible for guaranteeing equal rights under the law, and it obligated the states to uphold the rights for all citizens, not just whites. When an amendment is created for the Constitution, it's first passed by Congress, and then the states have to ratify it. So it's a long process that sometimes takes years. And the Congress felt like this would be something that the southern states should be required to ratify in order to be readmitted to not only the country, but also to be able to be readmitted to Congress. For southern states to send new representatives and senators to Congress, they would have to agree to this amendment. So then it came election time in 1866. In our country, sometimes we have elections in between the years of the presidential elections, and they're known as the congressional elections. And so what happened here was this was a congressional election. It was 2 years after the presidential election had taken place in 1864, where Lincoln had won again. And now, in this election, the people would have a chance to vote for new senators and representatives that would make up this new Congress. And it would kind of show whether or not the people of the northern states, because at that point many of the southern states hadn't been readmitted yet, it would show whether or not the northern states agreed with some of these ideas that the Congress had put out, like the 14th Amendment and like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau. And in the results of the election, it was shown that definitely most of the North agreed with the Congress and not the president. Before the election results came in, Johnson himself actually toured around the country, mostly in the South as well, and he encouraged Southerners to stand against it, even though he was the president of the country trying to bring the South back into the Union. It kind of made no sense for him to go around and try to get people against the laws of the country at that point, but that kind of shows what his values were. He definitely did not want Congress to create laws and amendments that would help black people. And so in this campaign, he tried to tour the nation and slander his opponents. He got to the point where he was cussing at people and getting into confrontation with hecklers. And just that kind of behavior from a president put a lot of people off. And so when the election results came in, the Republican majority in Congress increased, and now they had a solid majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And more than that, there were more radicals elected that were Republicans, and that kind of lessened the views and the weight of the moderates. So, pretty much from this point on, after the 1866 congressional elections, the radicals had a firm control over Congress, and so now they were in a position to put into place their own plan because they knew that if President Johnson vetoed any of their laws, they could just override the veto because they had enough majority now. Some of the key leaders of the radical Republicans were the names that you see here. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. He was the one that had been beaten up in the halls of Congress before the Civil War for verbally attacking the South. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania, and George Julian, who was a congressman from Indiana. Basically, what these radicals wanted to do now that they had the majority that was necessary to push their ideas through was to occupy the South with military rule by physically sending troops into the southern states to make sure they complied with all of the new laws and restrictions that the Congress was going to make. They wanted to take away a lot of the land from these large plantation owners and distribute some of that land to the newly freed slaves, which seems kind of unfair, but to them, this was one of the only ways to ensure that African Americans would have opportunities to get on their feet. And they wanted to increase federal aid for schools so that newly freed slaves and poor whites could now receive an education for many of them for the first time in their lives. Some Republicans, even though it was mostly controlled by radicals, some Republicans were a little bit concerned that these ideas went a little bit too far and interfered with people's right to property, especially with the idea of taking land away from rich people and giving it to the newly freed slaves. And so some people were kind of not so sure whether or not this went against the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But the Congress did succeed in passing some laws during this time. There was a Reconstruction Act of 1867 passed, which pretty much placed the South under the rule of the Army. It separated the South into 5 military districts, and troops were sent into each one to make sure that the South abided by the laws. On this map, you can see the division of the southern states into those 5 military districts. Some districts just contained one state, like right here with Virginia. Other districts contained more than one state. It kind of depended on where the Congress felt like the most troops needed to be concentrated. After this first Reconstruction was passed Reconstruction Act was passed in 1867, which you can see here Johnson did veto, but because they had that majority, they were able to override the veto. There were a couple of other acts that were passed in 1867 and 1868, and you can see what some of these acts detailed on your screen here. Probably the most significant aspect of these Reconstruction Acts that were passed after the first one was this first one right here. The Congress realized that if the southern states could quickly be brought back into the country, that they could then continue with some of their new ideas and reconstructing the South. So the Congress said that if the southern states accepted that 14th Amendment, which was the one back here that said that the government was responsible for guaranteeing equal rights under the law and obligating states to recognize the basic rights of every person, then they could quickly be readmitted into the country. So that shows you how important that these Congress members felt that the 14th Amendment was. There were basically 3 main amendments passed during the years of Reconstruction by the radical Republicans in Congress. The 13th was the one passed right at the end parts of the Civil War, which outlawed slavery across the United States. The 14th is the one that we just talked about, which basically said that all persons are considered citizens, no matter what skin color you have, and that states are required to follow the rights and laws for every person, equal protection under the laws. Finally, the 15th Amendment gave everybody who was a male, anyways, the right to vote. So you could not prohibit an African American from voting just because of the color of skin. Now, women did not have the right to vote at this point, but any male could now vote. Finally, you can understand that Johnson was probably pretty upset about these radical Republicans and passing all these laws, especially the fact that he vetoed most of their ideas and they still passed them with the override. And so Congress was really wanting to actually get Johnson out of the way completely so they wouldn't have to keep battling with him. He was a major obstacle to what they were trying to do. So basically, they had to find a loophole or a technicality to get him out on. And so they realized that Johnson had some patterns of behavior behavior in the past that you can see right here, they decided to create this law, which they know that the president would violate, and therefore they could use that as a way to impeach him, which he did. He violated the law by firing this person right here. And so the impeachment proceedings began, and he was impeached in the House of Representatives, but when it came to the Senate, it fell one vote short of the necessary 2/3 to completely get him out. So he was very nearly impeached and would have been the first president to ever do so, but he was the first president to get that close. That shows you the competition between the radical views and the moderate views during this Reconstruction period, which we'll discuss farther in the last recording about Reconstruction.